Okay, looks like we have a question here. Does your modeling process include any form of cross-validation or validation against held-out data? Yes, that's one of the very first steps that it does when it organizes the data, is to break it into training and test data, and then that's really where a lot of the art comes in for the user, is then in fine-tuning the models to say, okay, here's how it actually did on test data. Let's try making a change to this particular variable, or maybe eliminating the variable, and let's see if that really made any difference on the holdout data. So yes, we do. That is definitely a part of it, and also for the simulation that's performed, the simulation is based on sampling from the holdout data, and so to the extent that you've got overfitting, that you didn't take care of on the modeling side, hopefully at least on the simulation side, you're reflecting that you've got wider variation than that, because you're using the held-out data for that. There was a question on, does the model produce a measure of the variability around the ultimate claim and loss ratio projections? Yes, the exports that we generated in the graphs are concentrating on the averages or the distribution, but obviously not both at both times. But you've got actually at the policy level that sort of view of differentiation. Now, you do have some questions about convergence as you simulate going forward. You have that full variability at the policy level, probably not. But for some aggregations of policies, then you start to see a better view of that variability. There was a question about system requirements necessary to produce a satisfactory experience, getting the models to run in our lifetime. Can it happen on a standalone PC, or does it require processing power over server? If yes, how strong a PC? I just have a garden variety HP laptop that I'm running this on. And it is the case where, not unlike a CAT model or something like that, where you are doing a significant amount of simulation, that you are sometimes setting up the machine to run overnight for the simulation purpose. But it is all very workable for a standard kind of workstation, and not having a project that ends up taking months. We're talking about days or weeks, depending on how fully you want to delve into, try different parameterizations of models where you exclude different variables. What impact does that actually have on my simulation? Obviously, there's a lot you can dig into here, but you can also see a lot very quickly within a matter of days and hours in the case of actually seeing what the predictive models are saying in themselves. The question on how are the models accounting for changes by the claims department in their closure rates. This is different than looking at closure rates by exposure type. So we always include the transaction date as one of the variables. And so basically calendar period changes, such as a change in the underlying environment or change in the claims handling environment, those would show up in the transaction date. And obviously at that point, when you see something in there, then you want to have that discussion with the claims department. But at least at that point, you've made adjustments for all of the other variables that you're looking at. It's not just saying, okay, our closure rates are down. It's saying our closure rates are down after adjusting for everything else that we know about the claims and the exposures. And so that is obviously a very important thing to look at, and even just having that information in the first place makes it very valuable. The question on the perpetual license option, for the optional $3,000 for yearly maintenance, does that include future upgrades? Yes, it does. So that's a big part of what the maintenance is, and obviously this is we're brand new out with this software. There's going to be a lot that we're adding to it. We're using it on a regular basis as well, and like the predictive modeling software, we're always looking for ways to make it better, for ways to make it more powerful, different types of graphical output, and yes, the maintenance covers that. Does the software assist with grouping of data? We saw a little bit there with the tiering structure. There's more that we want to do there around giving the user the opportunity to define the reserve groups based on what they're seeing here. We're just scratching the surface of that right now. But definitely in looking at that explanatory graph, for example, to say what ends up making the biggest difference, those become natural things then for doing reserve group segmentation. And like I said before, that really becomes the link between a traditional triangle analysis and what we're doing here. Ultimately, to an auditor or a regulator or anybody else who's looking at your outside data, you can show them what you did through this sort of analysis, but you need to bring that back into a world that everybody's familiar with, and to be able to say, hey, if I segment my reserve groups in this way, looking at this particular class that I find to be very predictive, or looking at this particular geography, or whatever it is, and I break up triangles that way, then I can show you that we're growing into the ones that develop faster, or whatever that view is to be. Question on how well the software works on various lines of business, personal lines versus commercial lines. I can tell you that we've seen a lot of insight on it for a wide variety. We've looked at homeowners business, we've looked at D&O, we've looked at workers' compensation, medical malpractice, wide variety here, and we're seeing a lot of interesting information. Besides SQL Server, what other software or hardware do you assume the client needs to have in order to use the product? The SQL Server piece is probably is the main one, and actually the one that is the trickiest part of the installation process overall, because you have to make sure that it's installed the right way with the right permissions and all of that. We do have a document that walks you through that. That really is it. On the predictive modeling software, though, you've got an optional piece of software called MapPoint from Microsoft that makes that software even more valuable, because you can really see any sort of geographical data very, very clearly. So that's I think $300 or so from Microsoft, and I would highly recommend getting that as well. The question on, do the mathematics behind the model work like a GLM? We don't have a lot of time for a complete discussion here, but the short answer is no. That really we're looking at a technique here that is actually distribution free, that we're not making any distributional or link assumptions. We are, like any good predictive modeling approach, looking at things on the margin, looking at holdout data, considering variables after excluding the impact of other variables, and aiming towards simplicity, all of those sorts of things you typically assume with predictive modeling, but it is not a GLM. And the reason is, I think that the assumptions typically underlying a GLM of identically distributed error terms and being able to just use a 2 or 3 parameter or even 4 or 5 parameter distributional form are often too simplistic, really, for what we're dealing with here. We have a question on how does the model handle changes in categorical statuses of a claim over its lifetime. For example, a claim isn't in lawsuit, then a year later it turns into a lawsuit, it isn't a fidelity and becomes one, etc. That is an important question. Right now we're assuming that those things are static. In a future release, we will have the potential to add those as their own models, to be able to say, basically like a transition matrix for bonds. It would be an analogy. What's the potential for something to change its state? So these variables that are being included are ones that would exist at the beginning of that that claim. An important one would be the age, especially for something like workers' compensation. You could have the original age at the time of the time of the incident, but it would be also a value to say, okay, we want to increment that forward. The two things right now that get incremented forward as you simulate are the age of development. Obviously, that increases, and that is a very powerful variable in almost all analyses. Although I would argue it's the only one really used in a triangle analysis, and the case reserve itself. That changes over time as well. So both of those things are treated as being dynamic, and those are predictive models predictive variables in almost all the models. But other things like claim categorical statuses right now are not being changed. Okay, so clarification to a previous question about grouping things. It wasn't so much on the reserving side, apparently, but really more on grouping different types of business together. Categorical data, do you have the ability to kind of group that into different groups? Certainly for numeric data, that's a very common thing to do. Let's say you've got credit score on there and you wanted to use that. you've got the option to group that. It will find breaks on that to give roughly equal size exposure to each bin. But as far as grouping together, the software itself doesn't have the ability necessarily to pick and choose to say, I want to take the following 3 category values and combine them together into one. You would have to do that outside of the model. It's an interesting idea for going forward, but we've thought about that in the predictive modeling software as well. And so it'd be nice to add that as a kind of on-the-fly sort of adjustment. All right, I think that's about all the time we've got here, and I think we've hit just about all the questions here. Apologize if we have not. There's a short 1-question survey following the webinar that if you wouldn't mind answering that, we'd be very thankful. By all means, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to give me a call. My number is 651-293-8008, or shoot me an email at chris.gross@cgconsult.com. And thank you very much for your attentiveness, and everybody have a great day.